So before we reflect on this ancient book of the Bible, the book of Lamentations, I want you to hear these words from Psalms, from the ancient psalmist. And it's Psalm 34, verse 18. And if you want to read this verse with me or just look at it as I read it, it's on the at the top of your bulletin where the order of service begins. You'll see it listed there. These words go like this: the Lord is close. Some translations read, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Read that with me from your bulletin. Ready? The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. With that promise in mind, I invite you to pray with me. Oh God, may the words of my mouth, as well as the meditations and reflections of all our hearts, may they be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at a very important topic that could be called the elephant in the room. Now, the elephant in the room is an English idiom, and it refers to an obvious problem or an uncomfortable situation that everybody knows about. They know it's there, but nobody wants to talk about it. And I'm going to suggest to you that today, living in these times such as these, that the elephant in the room is grief. 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 I looked it up on the way this morning in my dictionary, and just to help us really know what we're talking about, grief, according to the dictionary, is keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss, sharp sorrow, painful regret, a cause or occasion of keen distress or sorrow. When the pandemic hit March of 2020, there was an article that resonated with me. It was widely circulated, and the title of that article was, "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." Suddenly our world changed. I know you don't need me to remind you of this, but never again are we going to be where we were or what we were before all this has suddenly happened. And it happened, this change, so abruptly. But never again are we going to be the same. And with all this change, there is pain and there is loss. Now, I know some struggle or suffering more than others, but we all are experiencing some level. Some of us is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, but we're all experiencing some kind of pain and loss and grief. And what makes this season so unique is it's not just individual grief, it's a collective kind of grief. I mean, this is touching, the whole world is changing, and it's a seismic shift. And so it feels so collective. Our grief feels collective. Now, it almost feels biblical because when you read the Bible, there's so much collective grief. There are plagues and famines that we read about. There are wars and genocides. There are cities and even nations in ruin, dust and ash. And so goes the book of Lamentations. Now, the book of Lamentations is found in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and it is arguably the saddest book in the entire Bible. And it's pretty short. It consists of 5 chapters, and they are well organized. I don't read Hebrew, but I've read that they're like in this acrostic form, well structured, so that they can be easily remembered. And it's a poem. That's what Lamentations really is. These 5 chapters are a poem. And you could call it a song, you could call it a dirge, really. You could call it a song of grief, a song of lament, a song of mourning. I asked we posted on Facebook, and many of you responded, what is the saddest song you've ever heard? I can't list them all, but I'm going to go with 10. Someone said the saddest song he'd ever heard is You Never Even Called Me by Name by David Allan Coe. Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven was mentioned. One of you mentioned Fleetwood Mac's Landslide. George Jones's He Stopped Loving Her Today. One More Day by Diamond Rio. Hello in There by John Prine. Cats in the Cradle, You'll Never Walk Alone. I think that's from a musical, Carousel. I'd never heard this song before, but I heard it, and it's certainly a tearjerker. He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother by Neil Diamond. But the one that wins, ding, 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 there always has to be a winner. Doug Vaughan mentioned it, In the Arms of an Angel by Sarah McLachlan, especially when it's on one of those animal cruelty commercials. Really, thank you for participating. Isn't it a great joy to share life together, even in challenging times? You know, I was thinking about sad songs because I listen to a lot of them for some reason. And I was remembering that animated movie from the 1980s, An American Tale. You remember that precious, adorable mouse singing Somewhere Out There. The theme from Schindler's List comes to mind. And I love that song from the 90s by R.E.M., Everybody Hurts. When that song comes on, I'm on a run, I just plow through it. Everybody hurts. And then there's that classic song by Hank Williams. Goes like this. I can't remember the title. I'm so lonesome I could cry. The book of Lamentations was written sometime after the year 586 BCE, before the Common Era, because that is when Jerusalem was completely destroyed. It was captured and held in exile for many years by the Babylonians. Now, that event in time, in history, there was so much human suffering then that it's hard to even imagine. And so this poem, the book of Lamentations, is filled with very raw, brutal language. It's filled with anger and resentment and sadness. It is a sad, sad song of survival because these people were left, they were in exile, and they had had so much, and now they had so little. And so we read verses in this book about people would grind their teeth in gravel. We read about how compassionate women would boil their babies for food because they were so pierced with hunger, so deprived and drained. It's a desperate time. We do not know who wrote the book. Now, tradition says it was written by the weeping prophet, the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah comes immediately before, and then you have the book of Lamentations. But it's a desperate book. People who had had so much now have so little. Think rape, pillage, burned and barren land. Think a city in ruins. Think an entire temple. Their Holy of Holies. We got a glimpse of what this was like last June. Their whole Holy of Holies completely destroyed. And they're angry. They are furious. And they want to know where is their God and why their God has abandoned them. And so the book of Lamentations begins with this one word. And the whole poem begins with this simple word called how. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. And this is a cry. How is a cry out to God that why would God allow human suffering? And the book, this ancient book of Lamentations, doesn't really resolve that question or give any firm answers. And to be honest with you, anything I've read in Christendom doesn't resolve the answer of human suffering. But what the gift of this book is, and why it's so important that we remember it and read it, especially in times like these, is that it shows us as people of faith how to express our grief in very raw and emotive kind of ways, how to pour out our tears to God and pour out our hearts to God. And so there are 3 lessons I think we can learn today from this ancient book of Lamentations. And the first lesson that I want us to learn is this: feel your feelings. And that goes for you who are too busy. You don't have time to feel your feelings. It goes for those of you who are like I am, and you grew up in a family where you were told to get control of your emotions and get on with it. And it goes for those of you who are terrified. I mean, you are so terrified that if you shed just one tear, then your eyes are going to turn into fire hoses, and you won't be able to control your tears. You ever heard the phrase that tears show where God is at work? Jesus said it this way, blessed are those who mourn. And yet we live in what's been called a grief-phobic kind of world. You see, our culture does not give permission and space for us to grieve. Many, many years ago, when you lost a loved one in the family, you wore black for as many months as 6. And you covered your mirrors so that you didn't have to look at how miserable you looked. And today, someone dies in the family and you have to be at work the very next week. We don't make space or give permission to grieve our sadness, our pain, and our loss. And yet, we're told by therapists and counselors, Richard Rohr says it this way, we cannot, let this sink in, you cannot heal what you cannot acknowledge. That's so true. So I know intellectually that I am supposed to feel my feelings, but let me tell you I'll confess to you what happens to me when I try to feel my feelings. It's like looking inside an empty shoebox. Hello, what feelings? You know? I can't even really recognize them. And that's because I have been so conditioned in a culture, in a family, to compartmentalize my feelings. You know, put them on a shelf and then barrel on, press on, get over it. So I'm learning more and more that this is not healthy. And it's important that I learn to grieve my losses and my pain. And so I'm having to recondition myself. It doesn't come naturally for me. So I'm having to set time aside. During this past year and how many ever months, I've had to actually do this daily in appropriate ways. We don't want you going around crying all the time. We have to set limits and only do this when it's appropriate and when we have safe boundaries. But I've had to recondition myself and learn again how to grieve, feel my feelings. And I thought I would share a few ways of how I do that. Now, we all grieve differently, but maybe something that I share will trigger in your imagination and be helpful to you as you grieve your pain and loss that we're all experiencing on some level. So I learned about myself a few years ago that I have this terribly bad habit. Anybody here like to complain? Preachers do it all the time. You go to a clergy gathering, and you just have, it's like, who's going to complain the most? And so I caught myself just everywhere I go, I was just complain. And then I learned that complaining is really a way of hiding how powerless you are. It's when you don't have power, when you realize that you're not in control. And so I have been experimenting with this way. This is how I'm grieving, learning to feel my feelings. And I'm experimenting with this thing called conscious complaining. And here's what that looks like. I invite a friend that I trust, or I will go to a family member that I trust that's safe and will love me no matter what, or I might go to a counselor. And for 3 minutes, I get to complain, and that person can't give advice, that person can't fix it, and that person can't come up with the solution. All that they get to do for me in those 3 minutes of complaining is hold it, listen. And what happens is when you're truly listened to, what you realize is all that complaining is unveiling. If you do it consciously, it unveils the pain and sorrow that you are feeling. Sometimes we don't need our problems solved. We live in a fix-it kind of culture. So if you're the type that's holding someone's grief, just for 3 minutes, try it. Just hold their pain. Now, another way that I grieve is I write it down. I'm not a big journaler, but if I'm feeling particularly anxious that day, I'll say, today I'm feeling blank, and I'll fill in the blank. And then on my smartphone, I have an app called Insight Timer. And before I meditate in the mornings, it will ask me, it's like these little these faces, and they say, are you confident? Are you sad? Are you lonely? But it's a way to check in, to feel my feelings. The other thing I've learned to do is get in touch with my body. Sometimes go for a gentle walk, go for a swim, not for just being competitive or to strengthen my athleticism, but to get in touch with the gift of this body that God has given me. You know, the body is a major truth teller. It won't betray you. It won't lie. It's going to tell you exactly what you're feeling. So I have had to learn to go, why is my neck so tense? Why are my shoulders tense? Why are my hands clammy? And why is my stomach in knots? Because I'm up here trying to speak from memory to a whole bunch of people about a very important topic. And speaking in public is sometimes scary. Feel your feelings. Your body is a truth teller. Another thing I do to feel my feelings is I turn to music. Did you know I'm a hummer? I don't have a Hummer, but I'm a hummer. If you're around me enough, you'll hear me. Usually it's a song from my childhood. I didn't say I was good at it, but I do hum. I'll catch myself almost involuntarily. It's sort of self-soothing. And I like to listen to sad music. I don't recommend this to everyone because some people it will take them into a darker place. But for me, there's nothing more soothing, James and Jeannie, than that cello or those violin strings to soothe my soul. Sometimes I go to poetry. Not always. That waxes and wanes. But the point is, you cannot feel your feelings. You cannot process them with your head. You can't think them. And whatever it takes to shift you from your thinking to your heart. I love what Rainier Rilke, the poet, said about grief or pain. He says, there's no place to put our pain except to give it back to the earth itself, to the heaviness of the oceans, from which ultimately comes the salt water which makes up our tears. Our tears connect us to the oceans that spawned us. Tears show where God's at work. Lesson number 1 from the book of Lamentations, feel your feelings. The second lesson is this: feel your feelings to grow. Why would an entire book of the Bible, the book of Lamentations, be devoted to lament, to mourning, to grief? Look at the ancient songbook of the Israelites, the book of Psalms. We have 150 hymns or songs or poems. And did you know around 70%, maybe even 2/3 of those psalms are psalms of sadness, grief, and lament? Why? Why would the Bible, and I didn't mention the book of Job, which I know is some of your favorite book. It's considered the oldest book in the Bible, and it's all about human suffering. So why so much attention in the Bible about sorrow? I believe it's because it's important. And I'm going to say to you that if we want to grow and mature, then we need to grieve. Bob, I loved your prayer today. It touched my heart. And I loved what you said about how we need to be part of communities where we build each other up and not rip each other apart. We need to be healthy communities. Speak the truth in love. Be honest. Have integrity with one another. And if we're not grieving our pain and loss, here's what happens to us. We get bitter and angry and resentful. And what that leads to is defensiveness. Or some people like to give the silent treatment. Some people become passive aggressive. Some people get sarcastic. We start the blame game. Or we become violent. And we've seen that played out over and over and over. And it rips our communities, our families, our nation apart. I like to use an illustration when it comes to grief. This is what happens when we bury it, when we push it down again and again. We're like a hot bottle of Coke or Diet Coke, whichever one you like. I don't think either are good for you, but anyway. It's like a hot bottle of soda. And when we're shaken to our core over an extended period of time, then eventually the inevitable is going to happen and we are going to explode. And Henry Nouwen says this, it's the whole thesis to the sermon, and it's on your bulletin, and I invite you to take it home and reflect and dwell on these wise words. The degree to which we grieve our own losses is in direct proportion to the depth and quality of the compassion that we can offer others. You know, the church can be one of the most uncompassionate places out there. I have siblings that won't come to church. They say it's too homophobic, it's too cliquish, it's too judgmental, it's too hypocritical. Why would I go there? I need a place where I can be affirmed and built up. And we can be so lacking in compassion. And I wonder if it's because we haven't grieved. We haven't taken the time to grieve. You know, where I think God is calling this church, I think God is calling this congregation to be healthy and to be filled with people who live healthy lives. I've been reading a lot about how you cannot be spiritually mature if you're not emotionally healthy. And you're going to be hearing more about this because I'm learning all about it. But if we are going to be the face of Christ in a world that's in great hurt and need, we have to grieve. Great leaders grieve greatly. Great leaders grieve greatly. And if you need help with this, I'm available. Come and talk to me. There's much I can say about this topic. And if you just need me to hold your complaining, I will do that for you, but only for 3 minutes. I never said that this would be easy. Following Jesus is not easy. But as Mother Teresa says, we're called not to be successful, but faithful. So lesson number 2, feel your feelings to grow. Now, the last lesson, third lesson from the ancient book of Lamentations is to feel your feelings to grow in God's grace. The promise of the gospel is that Jesus never, ever shies away from human sorrow and suffering. In fact, Jesus enters into it, and by entering into it and holding it, redeems it. Now, I would not have written redemption that way. To me, redemption and salvation would have come from an Oreo blizzard from Dairy Queen. But that's not how the world works. Think about the dark world that Jesus was born into. It was one of the darkest times in history. And he entered into it as a lowly infant. And then he was born into a poor family. And think about the people that he welcomed into his fold. They were usually sick, lepers. They were in the shadows of the world. They were prostitutes, tax collectors. These were women and children, anybody in the shadows. Jesus says, come to me in a redemptive kind of way. And then we know that he endures the worst cruelty possible. He endures the cross. And so Scripture calls Jesus the suffering servant, a man of sorrows. And in John's gospel, when he learns that his beloved friend Lazarus has died, that's where we get the shortest verse in the Bible, and we know that he weeps. Jesus weeps. And Jesus continues to weep with each and every one of us today in a highly personalized way, and Jesus continues to weep with the entire world in a highly collective way. In Matthew's gospel, we learn at the very end that Jesus is Emmanuel. And the promise he gives to us is, I will be with you, not yesterday or just in the future or at a moment in this present time, but when? Always. Jesus says, I will be with you always and even to the end of the age. The book of Lamentations, when they were at their lowest moment possible as a nation, when they had had so much and then suddenly they had so little. In the middle of this book, we get these words, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, and great is your faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. And we're still singing the song. We're going to sing it today as we close out our worship. And let me end with a short illustration. I think you're going to like it. It's about a little boy, and he was visiting his grandmother, and she brought him to church. And they were worshiping together in the pews, and they were sitting there, and the little boy started to wiggle and squirm. He was so restless, and then he whispered aloud, he said, "I am so bored." And the grandmother squeezed his arm and chided him. And she said to him, "You are not bored." Whatever you are feeling today, I want you to know that I give you the permission and space. This church gives you the permission and space. The Word of God for the people of God, an entire book of the Bible, gives us permission and space to feel your feelings, to feel your feelings to grow, and to feel your feelings to grow in God's grace. So be it, and so it is. Amen.